In the 1st century, the Roman Empire stretched across continents, its legions dominating lands from the rolling hills of Gaul to the deserts of Judea. Power was absolute, yet fragile. In the provinces, governors and local elites ruled in the shadow of Rome, collecting taxes, maintaining order, and quelling dissent. Judea, a land steeped in centuries of Jewish faith, tradition, and prophecy, was no exception. Rome didn't just occupy it, controlled, monitored, and exploited. And in this charged environment, whispers of a man named Jesus began to circulate. The political landscape was a delicate balance of power. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, was a figure both feared and resented. He represented the might of an empire that demanded loyalty, yet he also needed to navigate the treacherous currents of local politics. The Jewish religious leaders, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes were powerful in their own right. They guided the people spiritually, but they also feared any threat to their authority. Rome allowed them religious autonomy, but it came with strings attached. Maintain order, suppress unrest, and keep Rome's coffers full. Amid this tension, Jesus of Nazareth began his ministry. He wasn't a general, nor a politician, nor a rebel in the traditional sense. He spoke of a kingdom, but not one of military conquest or political ambition. Instead, his kingdom was spiritual, ethical, and revolutionary in its simplicity. Love your neighbor, feed the hungry, care for the outcast, question the hypocrisy of the powerful. To some, this was inspiring. To others, it was dangerous. The Roman authorities didn't fully understand him, but they understood the risk of any figure capable of gathering crowds and stirring the masses. Rome's power was rooted in fear and the efficiency of its empire. Legions, taxation, and alliances with local elites ensured control. But the heart of Judea beat to a different rhythm, one of prophecy, hope, and longing for liberation. Jesus entered this world not with a sword, but with words, miracles, and a message that challenged both the religious hierarchy and, ultimately, the empire itself. In these first encounters, seeds of confrontation, misunderstanding, and inevitability were sown. The story of Jesus is not just a tale of faith. It is a story of politics, power, and survival. To understand his journey, we must first understand the empire he lived under. A world where loyalty was bought, fear was enforced, and one man's message could shake the foundations of the most powerful state in history. Shadows of authority. The streets of Jerusalem buzzed with life merchants hawking figs and olives, children darting between stalls, Roman soldiers marching with stiff precision. Every corner of the city reflected the uneasy dance between occupation and faith. The Jewish religious leaders watched closely, their eyes as sharp as the daggers they metaphorically wielded. To them, Jesus was more than a preacher. He was a puzzle, a disruption, and potentially a threat. The Pharisees, guardians of the law, feared the erosion of tradition. Their authority was rooted in scripture and interpretation. And here was a man who challenged both, not with force, but with words. He healed on the Sabbath, debated openly, and spoke of God's kingdom as accessible to all, even the sinners, the outcasts, and the marginalized. Every sermon he gave in the synagogues, was a quiet thunderclap to the religious elite. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were pragmatic, focused on political survival. They had much to lose under Roman scrutiny. Their wealth, their position, their influence all depended on maintaining peace and pleasing the occupying power. A man who could mobilize crowds, who spoke of a higher law than theirs, was dangerous, not because he wielded armies, but because ideas, when they spread, could ignite rebellion faster than any sword. Rome, ever watchful, saw the potential for unrest but often misunderstood the subtleties of Jewish culture. Pilate received reports of Jesus not as a prophet, but as a possible insurgent, a charismatic man drawing followers in Jerusalem during Passover, a time when nationalist fervor surged, was a problem. Rome's instinct was blunt: suppress the threat before it became a rebellion. But Jesus moved differently. He was patient, subtle, and unwavering in his moral authority. Every miracle, every parable, every public confrontation was a test. For the leaders, the challenge was maintaining control without appearing weak. For Jesus, it was about exposing hypocrisy, inspiring faith, and preparing a people to see beyond the tangible into the spiritual revolution he represented. In this tense collision of faith and politics, Jerusalem became a chessboard. Every move mattered. The religious leaders maneuvered to protect their power. Rome maneuvered to maintain control. And Jesus maneuvered with a quiet certainty that would eventually place him at the center of history. In these shadows of authority, the seeds of conflict were not just political, they were spiritual, ethical, and destined to change the world forever. The gathering storm, word of Jesus spread like wildfire through the narrow streets and dusty hills of Judea. People came from villages, towns, and even distant regions, drawn by tales of healings, wisdom, and a message that challenged the ordinary rules of life. Fishermen abandoned nets, tax collectors paused their ledgers, and the marginalized lepers, beggars, and the oppressed found hope in a man who saw them as human, not outcasts. The crowds grew. Wherever Jesus spoke, listeners hung on every word. His parables simple on the surface, but profound beneath stirred minds and hearts alike. He spoke of a kingdom not built on swords or coins, but on love, justice, and mercy. Blessed are the meek, he declared. Blessed are the poor in spirit. These words resonated, but they also alarmed those in power, authority, whether Roman or religious. Fear's influence it cannot control. Pontius Pilate, in the governor's palace of stone and shadow, began to take notice. Rome's reports painted a confusing picture. A man who commanded crowds but posed no obvious military threat. Yet the timing, during festivals when Jerusalem overflowed with pilgrims, made Pilate cautious. One spark in the wrong place could ignite rebellion, and Rome had no patience for unrest. The governor relied on intelligence from local leaders, Sadducees, and priests, who whispered warnings, emphasizing that Jesus' growing popularity could destabilize the delicate balance Rome depended on. The Jewish religious elite grew increasingly uneasy. Publicly, they questioned Jesus' authority and debated him in the temple courts, trying to catch him in contradictions. Privately, fear gnawed at them. If Jesus' movement gained too much momentum, their power, prestige, and control over the people could collapse. They began plotting, subtly and quietly, looking for ways to neutralize him without inciting riots. Yet, amid this tension, Jesus' mission only gained clarity. His actions were deliberate, his teachings purposeful, healing the sick, challenging hypocrisy, and reaching out to those rejected by society were not random acts of compassion. They were statements of intent. Every word and deed quietly defied the expectations of an empire and the assumptions of its religious custodians. The stage was set. Rome observed, the religious authorities conspired, and Jesus' followers multiplied. The energy in the air was electric, charged with hope, fear, and inevitability. The story of a man, his message, and a powerful empire teetering on the edge of confrontation was no longer just a whisper. It was becoming a gathering storm that would shake history to a clash of crowns and laws. The sun rose over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the temple courts, where Jesus' voice rang out with authority that no robe or title could bestow. The Pharisees had sharpened their questions, their words designed like spears to trap him. "By what authority do you speak?" they demanded. "Who gave you the right to challenge our laws?" But Jesus answered with a calmness that unsettled them more than anger ever could. His words were precise, disarming, and layered with meaning, each answer cutting through the pretense of power and exposing hypocrisy. Without raising a hand, crowds gathered, drawn not by the spectacle of confrontation, but by the clarity of his message. The common people were beginning to see something that the leaders could not. Truth dressed in humility and authority, intertwined with compassion. Every parable, every miracle, every pointed critique of the temple, leadership chipped away at the illusion of control the Pharisees had built over decades. Yet these confrontations were more than religious disputes. They were political signals. In Rome's eyes, any disturbance in Judea, especially in the temple, was dangerous. Pilate and his aides depended on the Jewish elite to maintain order. And when the Pharisees approached him with complaints about this troublemaker, the seeds of a larger political crisis were sown. Rome did not care about theology, they cared about stability. But when faith stirred crowds and loyalty shifted, stability became a distant memory. The Sadducees, entrenched in pragmatism, whispered warnings behind closed doors. They understood that Jesus' challenges weren't merely theological, they threatened their collaboration with Rome. They had carved out influence and privilege by maintaining peace and placating the occupiers. Now, a man who spoke of divine authority above human law undermined everything they depended upon. Even among his own followers, tensions arose. Some expected a militant Messiah, a deliverer who would overthrow Roman oppression. Jesus' path was radically different, rooted in moral authority and spiritual revolution. He healed, he taught, he forgave, yet every act was a calculated ripple, challenging both human power and societal norms. By the time the crowds dispersed each evening, the clash was unmistakable. On one side, Rome's calculated authority. On the other, the religious elite clinging to control. And in the middle, Jesus, a man wielding influence without a throne, whose crown was unseen, yet whose power would shake the foundations of empire. law and faith alike. The tension was palpable. The city breathed uneasily, sensing that a confrontation larger than any single dispute loomed on the horizon. A collision of faith, power, and history that could not be avoided. Miracles and the ripple of influence. Word of Jesus' deeds spread faster than any rumor or official decree could contain. From Capernaum to Galilee, people whispered about the blind who could see, the paralyzed who walked, and the lepers who were restored to society. Each miracle was more than an act of compassion. It was a statement of power far different from Rome's legions or the temple. Elite's decrees, Jesus wielded authority over life itself, and the crowds took notice. Pilate received new reports. These weren't tales of armed rebellion or violent uprisings. But the empire knew better than to underestimate the influence of a man who could command such devotion. Rome's strategy was always simple: neutralize threats before they grow. And yet, how do you suppress someone whose power comes from hope, faith, and the human heart? The Pharisees grew increasingly anxious. The people were listening, cheering, and following. Their authority, carefully maintained through ritual and law, was being quietly dismantled. Jesus' miracles challenged the boundaries of religious law, sparking debates that drew larger crowds each day. Healing on the Sabbath was not just defiance, it was a provocation. A demonstration that divine law and human law were not always aligned. The Sadducees and chief priests met in secret chambers, plotting, whispering, and strategizing. They feared Rome's wrath as much as they feared losing influence. The tension between preserving power and controlling a charismatic teacher reached fever pitch. Every public miracle was a spark, every parable a kindling. It was only a matter of time before a firestorm would ignite. Meanwhile, Jesus' followers multiplied. Disciples left their livelihoods, traveling from village to village, spreading stories of hope, forgiveness, and the coming kingdom. For ordinary people, the miracles were tangible proof that God's presence was among them, accessible and revolutionary, and in a society dominated by fear, taxation, and rigid hierarchies. This message of empowerment was both intoxicating and dangerous. Every act, every healing, every confrontation with authority created a ripple effect. Pilate and the Roman administrators debated silently. The elite in the temple grew desperate, and the people's devotion only deepened. Jerusalem itself seemed to hold its breath, sensing the approaching storm. Collision between earthly power and spiritual authority that could not be reconciled through fear or negotiation alone. Jesus' miracles were no longer just acts of kindness, they were catalysts. They challenged the empire, unsettled the powerful, and offered hope to the oppressed. The momentum was unstoppable, and with every passing day, the tension between faith, politics, and authority in Judea reached a boiling point. History was poised on the edge of a profound confrontation. Conspiracy in the shadows. As Jesus' influence grew, so did the unease among the Jewish elite. Behind the polished walls of the temple, in dimly lit chambers and quiet corridors, whispers turned into plotting. The Pharisees and Sadducees, once rivals, found common ground in their fear of a man who threatened both their authority and their fragile relationship with Rome. Jesus, Words of justice and mercy had become dangerous ammunition in a world ruled by hierarchy and fear. The chief priests feared losing more than control. They feared irrelevance. Every crowd that gathered to hear Jesus, every miracle that inspired awe, chipped away at decades of influence built through ritual, law, and intimidation. And the Roman authorities, who relied on these leaders to maintain order, would act swiftly if unrest erupted. The stakes were high, and the religious elite knew it. Secret meetings were held under the cover of night. Plans were whispered, names were suggested, alliances tested. Judas Iscariot, a man whose heart teetered between loyalty and temptation, began to be drawn into the plot. The promise of influence, security, or perhaps something darker, tugged at him. The convergence of fear, greed, and ambition made the elite willing to risk betrayal for the sake of self-preservation. Meanwhile, Jesus continued his ministry openly. In the marketplaces and along dusty roads, he taught, healed, and challenged the hypocrisy of those in power. Every public act was a statement, every word a spark. He did not wield a sword or call for rebellion against Rome, yet his very presence unsettled the rulers. His authority was different, invisible, moral, spiritual, and unyielding, and that made him all the more dangerous to those who relied on control and fear. Pontius Pilate remained cautious, aware that the situation could spiral out of control. Rome had no interest in religious debates, only in order. If Jerusalem descended into chaos, the governor would bear the consequences. But even Pilate could not fully grasp the subtle tension between divine authority and human power, the core of the storm brewing in the city. By the time the conspiracy gained momentum, the stage was set for a collision that would change history. The elite, desperate to protect themselves, and the empire, eager to maintain control, were moving toward action. And in the center of it all stood Jesus, a man whose kingdom was not of this world, yet whose path would confront earthly authority in ways no one could ignore. The shadows deepened, the whispers sharpened, and the inevitable confrontation edged ever closer. History was on the verge of a moment that would echo through the ages. The road to Jerusalem, the hills of Galilee were alive with whispers of hope and change. Jesus moved from village to village, teaching, healing, and drawing ever larger crowds. His disciples followed closely, their loyalty unwavering. Though their understanding often wavered, some imagined a political messiah who would overthrow Roman rule, while others simply marveled at the compassion and authority he displayed. Either way, the momentum was undeniable, and the world was beginning to take notice. Yet even as the crowds swelled, the tension grew. The Pharisees and Sadducees had intensified their surveillance, sending spies to observe, question, and report back. Every word Jesus spoke was dissected, every miracle scrutinized. They feared that once he entered Jerusalem, the city's pulse-stirring, Passover, a time already charged with anticipation of freedom, could turn into chaos, and Rome, ever watchful, would not tolerate unrest. Pilate, the governor, received word of the crowds and their fervor. From his palace, he studied the reports, weighing the threat. Rome had a simple rule: maintain peace, suppress rebellion, and protect the empire. Yet this was no ordinary threat. Jesus commanded loyalty, inspired faith, and moved hearts without lifting a sword. How do you quell a storm that flows through people's beliefs and emotions rather than armies and weapons? As Jesus and his disciples approached Jerusalem, the atmosphere shifted. The air carried the scent of anticipation, mixed with fear and expectation. Merchants closed shops, pilgrims arrived in droves, and temple gates opened to a city on the edge of spiritual and political tension. People lined the roads, waving palm branches, singing praises, and declaring allegiance not to Rome, but to the man who spoke of a kingdom beyond earthly power. For the religious elite, this was intolerable. Their carefully maintained authority, built on law, ritual, and fear, now faced a movement fueled by devotion and moral authority. The Sadducees and Pharisees exchanged urgent glances. Something had to be done. The wheels of conspiracy had already been set in motion, and the timing of Jesus' arrival in the city could not be ignored. Yet for Jesus, the journey was deliberate, purposeful, and unwavering. Each step toward Jerusalem brought him closer to confrontation, closer to fulfilling a destiny that transcended politics, power, and even life itself. The city, the empire, and the religious elite were all pieces on a chessboard. Yet he played a game beyond their understanding, moving with quiet certainty toward a collision that would change history forever. The road to Jerusalem was no ordinary journey. It was a march toward inevitability, where faith, authority, and destiny would meet in a way the world had never seen before. The triumphal entry and rising tension. The city of Jerusalem buzzed with life, a hive of pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers preparing for the Passover festival. Amid the throngs, a different kind of energy surged, a quiet, unstoppable wave of anticipation. Jesus approached the city riding a humble donkey, a striking contrast to the grandeur of Rome and the pomp of the temple elite. Yet the crowd's reaction was thunderous. People laid cloaks and palm branches on the road, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This was no ordinary procession. It was a symbolic declaration, a kingdom not of conquest, but of righteousness and divine authority. The crowd sensed it, the religious leaders feared it, and Rome watched it warily. Pilate, informed by his aides, understood the potential volatility. Jerusalem during Passover was already a tinderbox. A man commanding the devotion of thousands could spark unrest with a single word. Inside the temple, the Pharisees and Sadducees seethed. Their authority, carefully maintained through rituals, laws, and alliances with Rome, was being publicly challenged. Jesus' entry was more than a spectacle, it was a statement of power, of legitimacy that did not rely on wealth, position, or the empire. Every chant from the crowd chipped away at their control. Every palm branch laid in his honor a silent indictment of their leadership. For the people, hope was tangible. Centuries of expectation, oppression, and longing coalesced into this moment. They saw in Jesus a promise of something greater than Roman taxes, temple hierarchy, or political maneuvering, a vision of justice, mercy, and spiritual liberation. Yet even as voices cheered, shadowy murmurs of concern rippled through the city. The temple elite convened urgent meetings, plotting and scheming, determined to curb a movement that threatened everything they had built. Pilate remained cautious, calculating, and distant. Rome did not meddle in theology, but it did intervene when disorder threatened its authority. The balance between appeasing the temple leaders and controlling the masses was delicate, and the governor knew the slightest misstep could ignite rebellion. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem was a turning point, a public affirmation of his mission, and a provocation to both the religious hierarchy and the occupying empire. It was a moment of triumph for the people, a moment of fear for the leaders, and a moment of inevitability for history. The tension that had been simmering for years was now visible on every street, every market, and every temple courtyard. The city had witnessed processions before, but none like this. The collision of faith, politics, and power was imminent, and the world stood on the edge of a confrontation that would echo through eternity. The temple shaken, the temple courts, a place of prayer and tradition, suddenly erupted in a storm of righteous fury. Jesus entered, not with soldiers or weapons, but with a voice and authority that demanded attention. Tables were overturned, coins clattered across the stone floors, and merchants scrambled to escape the whirlwind of indignation. "My house shall be called a house of prayer," he declared, "but you have made it a den of thieves." This was not merely an act of anger, it was a calculated, symbolic confrontation. The temple, under the control of the chief priests and Sadducees, had become a center of exploitation. Pilgrims came to offer sacrifices, yet were forced to buy animals at inflated prices. Money changers profited off devotion. The sacred space, meant for spiritual communion, had been corrupted by commerce and power. Jesus' actions exposed the moral rot at the heart of religious authority. The crowds, already swelled from his triumphal entry, watched in awe. Murmurs of amazement spread quickly. Here was a man willing to challenge the powerful, to confront the corruption entrenched in the very heart of society. For the people, it was electrifying, a public demonstration that faith could defy oppression and authority. But the religious elite were incensed. Their authority, built over generations, was under public attack. The Pharisees whispered among themselves, plotting, calculating how to strike back without inciting riot. The Sadducees fretted, knowing Rome's eyes were always on them, monitoring for any disturbance that might suggest rebellion. The balance of power in Jerusalem was delicate, and Jesus had just thrown a stone into the calm waters, creating waves that would not settle. Pilate, hearing reports of the disturbance, raised a brow but remained detached. Rome did not intervene unless chaos threatened the empire. Yet the governor understood the significance. A man who could command crowds, challenge authority, and inspire devotion was inherently dangerous, even without armies or weapons. This act in the temple was more than a protest, it was a signal to everyone watching. Jesus was not just a preacher or miracle worker. He was a moral authority who could unsettle the structures of power with every word and action. By the end of the day, the city was charged with tension. The temple elite, the crowds, and Roman officials all sensed that the confrontation was escalating. The stage was set for an inevitable clash, a collision of faith, politics, and power that would soon reach its breaking point. The web of betrayal. As the echoes of Jesus' temple confrontation faded, a different kind of activity unfolded in the shadowed chambers of Jerusalem. The chief priests and Pharisees, humiliated and desperate, began weaving a web of betrayal. Public opposition had failed. They could not silence him with argument alone. The crowds adored him. The miracles inspired loyalty, and the moral authority he wielded could not be bought or threatened. Something more insidious was required. Whispers spread among the temple elite. A trusted disciple, a man close to Jesus, could be persuaded to act. Judas Iscariot, known for his meticulous nature and ambition, became the target. Greed, fear, and the promise of reward made him vulnerable. The chief priests appealed to both his ambition and his doubt, planting seeds of temptation that would eventually take root. In this web of politics and power, betrayal was not sudden, it was calculated, deliberate, and inevitable. The city itself felt the tension. Pilate, still monitoring reports, sensed the undercurrents of unrest. Rome had no interest in theology or morality. Their concern was order. Yet, a man who could command loyalty, gather crowds, and provoke authority even without an army was inherently dangerous. The governor relied on the Jewish elite to maintain peace, but he also knew their desperation could backfire, igniting chaos in the streets. Meanwhile, Jesus continued his mission. Each day brought new crowds, new teachings, and new miracles. He spoke openly about loyalty, the cost of discipleship, and the coming fulfillment of God's plan. His words were calm but powerful, foreshadowing the betrayal that was already in motion. The disciples, unaware of the full extent of the plot, trusted their teacher implicitly. Yet even among them, doubt and misunderstanding simmered. Every conversation, every public act, every whispered counsel in the temple moved history closer to a climax. The stakes were no longer just spiritual, they were political, social, and life-threatening. A man who challenged religious authority and inspired the masses had become a target, and the forces arrayed against him were relentless, methodical, and willing to cross any line to protect their power. By the time night fell over Jerusalem, the city was charged with an invisible electricity. The crowds celebrated, unaware of the plotting in the shadows. The elite prepared, the governor calculated, and Judas wrestled with temptation. The stage was set for a betrayal that would alter the course of history, proving that in the interplay of politics, power, and faith, no one, not even the Son of God, was untouchable. The shadow of treachery. Night fell over Jerusalem, draping the city in quiet tension. While the crowds rested, the temple elite convened once more, their whisper sharper, their plans clearer. The betrayal of Jesus was no longer an abstract thought, it was becoming a calculated strategy. Among the conspirators, Judas Iscariot stood at the crossroads of loyalty and temptation, the weight of decision pressing heavily upon him. Judas had walked beside Jesus for years, witnessing miracles, listening to parables, and seeing the lives transformed by his teacher's words. Yet, ambition and fear gnawed at him. The promise of silver, the allure of influence, and the pressure of the chief priests tugged at his conscience. It was in this delicate balance, faith versus personal gain, that history would pivot. Each step he took toward betrayal was deliberate, yet shrouded in doubt and internal conflict. In the outer streets, Jerusalem's pulse remained restless. Pilate, though distant, monitored reports with a growing sense of unease. Rome had long dealt with insurgents, but the subtlety of Jesus' influence confounded even the most experienced governor. There were no weapons, no armies, just a man whose words could move thousands, whose authority transcended physical force. That was precisely what made him a threat. Meanwhile, Jesus prepared for the coming days with quiet resolve. He continued teaching, knowing that every moment with his disciples and followers was a preparation for the trials ahead. He spoke of faith, sacrifice, and the cost of true discipleship, weaving foresight into his lessons. The disciples listened, often misunderstanding, yet their trust never wavered. The temple elite, frustrated by failed confrontations and public displays of defiance, finalized their plan. The strategy was clear: strike under the cover of darkness, away from the masses, with Judas as their guide. They hoped to neutralize the threat before it spiraled beyond control, underestimating the enduring power of faith, courage, and divine purpose. As the city slept, the pieces were moving on a dangerous board. The betrayer's footsteps echoed quietly in the night. The schemers whispered in hidden corridors, and the governor's gaze remained calculating, detached yet watchful. All the while, Jesus stood unaware of the full immediacy of betrayal, but fully aware of its inevitability. In this moment, history balanced on a knife's edge. Faith, loyalty, power, and treachery intertwined in ways that would soon ignite a series of events, echoing through centuries. The shadow of treachery had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. The Garden of Agony. The night air in the Garden of Gethsemane was heavy, thick with anticipation and sorrow. Olive trees stretched their gnarled branches over quiet paths, shadows dancing under the moonlight. Jesus led his closest disciples into the solitude of the garden, seeking a place of prayer and preparation. The tension was palpable, even as the world outside slept. Unaware of the storm about to break, he felt the weight of what was to come. The path ahead was not one of power or triumph as the world understood it, but of sacrifice and submission. Every teaching, every miracle, and every act of mercy had led to this moment, a confrontation with the forces of human authority and spiritual darkness. Alone with his prayer, Jesus wrestled with the inevitability of suffering, knowing that his mission transcended personal fear or pain. The disciples, though loyal, were weary and anxious. Peter, James, and John followed closely, yet their eyes betrayed confusion and unease. They had witnessed wonders, healings, and confrontations with authority, but the weight of what was imminent was beyond their comprehension. Stay awake, Jesus urged, not only for their safety but to prepare their hearts for what betrayal and confrontation would bring. In the shadows, Judas approached, each step deliberate, each heartbeat heavy with the burden of choice. The culmination of greed, fear, and ambition had brought him to this moment. He knew the plan, understood the consequences, and yet moved forward, guided by temptation and external persuasion. His arrival signaled the crossing of a threshold. The betrayal was no longer a whisper, it was reality. Suddenly, the garden stirred. Soldiers and temple guards, torches flickering in the darkness, moved with precision. Guided by Judas, the quiet sanctity of the garden was shattered by authority armed with fear and steel. Jesus, calm yet resolute, stepped forward, meeting betrayal not with resistance, but with awareness. Every step, every word, every act was deliberate, a testament to the power of moral and spiritual authority over fear and coercion. In these final moments before arrest, the tension between faith, power, and politics crystallized. The empire's influence, the religious elite's desperation, and human betrayal converged in a single, unavoidable confrontation. The Garden of Gethsemane became more than a place, it became a stage where history, destiny, and divine purpose intersected. This night would mark the beginning of a sequence that would shake Rome, challenge religious authority, and redefine faith for centuries to come. The agony was not merely physical, it was the intersection of heaven and earth, of power and obedience, of love and sacrifice. Rest in the moonlight, the stillness of the Garden of Gethsemane shattered as torches flared in the darkness. Roman soldiers and temple guards, guided by Judas, approached with measured precision. The clash of human ambition and divine purpose had reached its pivotal moment. Shadows stretched long across the stone paths, mingling with the fear and confusion of the disciples. Judas stepped forward, moving through the crowd, and betrayed his teacher with a single actor kiss, a gesture of loyalty twisted into treachery. The soldiers seized Jesus immediately. There was no resistance, no violent struggle. His calmness amidst the chaos startled even the hardened men of Rome, who were accustomed to threats that came with swords and shields. Here was a man whose authority transcended the physical, who did not need force to command presence. The disciples, startled and frightened, scattered. Peter, in a moment of desperation, drew his sword, striking one of the guards. Yet Jesus rebuked him, emphasizing that the path ahead would not be defined by human violence. Even as Rome's soldiers tightened their grip, Jesus' composure contrasted sharply with the panic, greed, and fear surrounding him. It was a demonstration of authority the world rarely witnessed, moral and spiritual command, confronting political and military power. The temple elite watched with cautious satisfaction. Their plan had succeeded. Jesus was in their grasp, away from the protective crowds, in a setting controlled by authority and secrecy. Yet, they underestimated the ripples that this arrest would create. Rome, always pragmatic, saw only a man captured under Jewish guidance. But the spiritual and historical consequences of this moment were far beyond their understanding. Pilate, still in his palace, received reports of the arrest and the potential unrest brewing in the city. The governor understood the stakes. An arrested man, beloved by the masses, could ignite rebellion if mishandled. Yet, in the political calculus of Rome, the Jewish leaders appeared as the immediate actors, enforcing their control while maintaining the delicate balance of authority under occupation. As Jesus was led away from the garden, the air remained heavy with anticipation. Every step toward the city, toward betrayal, and toward a destiny none could fully comprehend was marked by the tension between empire, religious authority, and faith. The arrest was not simply a political maneuver, it was a turning point in history, a moment where human betrayal collided with divine purpose. The moonlight illuminated the paths, the olive trees, and the faces of those who would witness events that would echo through centuries. The empire, the temple, and the disciples were all caught in a web that was only beginning to unfold. Judgment in the shadows. The high priest's courtyard was tense, filled with whispers, suspicion, and calculated anger. Jesus stood in the center, calm yet resolute, as the Sanhedrin assembled around him. The religious elite had orchestrated this moment with precision, away from the crowds, in secrecy, under the cloak of night. Their goal was simple: discredit him, convict him, and secure their grip on power. Yet the presence of divine authority in Jesus made their task far more complex than they anticipated. The chief priests and scribes hurled questions, accusations, and false testimonies. Each attempt meant to trap him, to force a misstep. Tell us, are you the Messiah? Are you claiming to be the Son of God? They demanded. The answers they received were calm, deliberate, and unyielding. Every response pierced the veil of deception, exposing their hypocrisy and ambition. The Sanhedrin, blinded by their fear of losing influence, did not recognize the profound authority they faced, not of Rome, but of truth and purpose. Witness after witness rose, offering conflicting and contradictory accounts. Yet none could provide a charge that would satisfy justice or law. In their desperation, they resorted to twisting words, manipulating perception, and bending tradition to their will. The crowd outside slept unaware, but inside, history was being shaped. Here, power met moral authority, and human fear confronted divine purpose. Amid the accusations, Jesus remained composed, fully aware of the stakes. He knew the path ahead: the physical trial, the political manipulation, and ultimately, the sacrifice that would redefine faith for centuries. His calmness contrasted sharply with the Sanhedrin's agitation, revealing the fragility of human power when confronted with truth. By the end of the night, the religious council achieved a technical victory. They secured a charge that could be presented to Roman authority. Yet even in their triumph, uncertainty lingered. Rome's approval was necessary for execution, and the empire's concern for order introduced a new layer of political complexity. The Sanhedrin could manipulate words and ritual, but they could not fully control the machinery of Rome or the hearts of the people who still followed Jesus. As dawn approached, the Sanhedrin handed Jesus over to the Roman authorities. The stage was set for the next active collision of politics, empire, and faith that would shake Jerusalem and resonate through history. The night's judgment had been cast, but the consequences would extend far beyond the shadows of the courtyard, into the streets, the hearts of the people, and the very soul of humanity. Trial before the empire. The early morning sun glinted off the stone walls of Pilate's palace, casting long shadows over the courtyard where Jesus was brought. Before the Roman governor, the air was thick with anticipation, tension, and fear. The religious leaders, having orchestrated the arrest and condemned him in the Sanhedrin, now sought the seal of Roman authority to make their judgment official. Rome did not execute religious decrees, it demanded order, control, and political stability. Pontius Pilate regarded Jesus with measured scrutiny. Here stood a man accused of defying the temple, claiming divine authority, and commanding the devotion of thousands. Yet there was no riot, no armed rebellion, only unwavering calm. Pilate was a man familiar with political intrigue, rebellion, and deceit. And he recognized a force unlike any he had seen, a moral and spiritual authority that transcended the empire's power. The Jewish leaders pressed their accusations, highlighting blasphemy and sedition. This man claims to be a king, they insisted. He challenges Caesar's authority. Pilate, aware of the delicate balance between appeasing Rome and avoiding civil unrest, probed cautiously, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Jesus' reply was measured, not defiant, yet loaded with meaning. A kingdom exists, but not one governed by earthly power. The governor sensed the tension rippling through the crowd outside. Pilate understood the political calculus: release him and risk angering the religious elite, condemn him and risk alienating the masses who revered him. His advisors whispered suggestions, each step weighed with careful consideration. Rome demanded order, yet authority alone could not suppress the momentum of truth and devotion. Pilate attempted to find a compromise. He offered symbolic gestures, probing the people's loyalty, even proposing release as a political maneuver. But the crowd, stirred by the religious leaders, called for crucifixion. The delicate equilibrium of power, fear, and political necessity began to tip. Pilate's authority, absolute on paper, collided with the unpredictable force of faith and popular devotion. In this trial, the clash of empire, religion, and destiny reached its apex. Jesus, calm yet resolute, faced not just human authority, but the machinery of an empire that could wield soldiers, laws, and execution with impunity. Every word, glance, and pause held significance, revealing the tension between worldly power and divine purpose. By the end of the encounter, the stage was set. Pilate, pressured and cautious, would face an impossible decision. The forces of Rome, the scheming religious elite, and the faith of the people converged in a moment that would alter the course of history forever. The crowd's verdict. The courtyard outside Pilate's judgment hall buzzed with tension. Early morning light revealed the faces of thousands who had gathered: pilgrims, merchants, and citizens, their voices a mixture of expectation, confusion, and manipulation. Inside, the Roman governor wrestled with the impossible. The man before him, calm, composed, and resolute, posed no military threat. Yet the leaders of the temple accused him of sedition, framing him as a danger to both religion and empire. Pilate sought reason. "Shall I crucify your king?" he asked, testing the crowd's reaction, attempting to appeal to their conscience. The people, swayed by the chief priests and their urgent counsel, shouted back in unison, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The roar echoed against the palace walls, a tidal wave of fear and political pressure. Pilate, seasoned in managing rebellion, understood the stakes. Any hesitation could spark chaos. Yet execution for a man so revered by the masses carried its own peril. He offered compromise. Tradition allowed for a prisoner's release during the Passover festival. Pilate proposed freeing Jesus, presenting the crowd with a choice between him and Barabbas, a convicted insurrectionist. The gamble was calculated. Rome often manipulated spectacle to maintain control. Yet the crowd, inflamed by the religious elite, demanded Barabbas and rejected the man of peace. Political strategy collided with popular fervor, and Pilate's authority, absolute in theory, began to crumble under the weight of public pressure. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Pilate washed his hands before the assembly, a symbolic gesture signaling that he bore no personal responsibility for the decision forced upon him. Yet the act could not erase the moral gravity of what was unfolding. The crowd had spoken, the elite had schemed, and the empire's machinery prepared to execute its order. Jesus faced the verdict not with fear or defiance, but with calm acceptance. His path, foretold and deliberate, now intersected with human politics, betrayal, and the harsh realities of empire. Every shout from the crowd, every plea from the priests, every decision from Pilate was part of a complex interplay of power, fear, and destiny. In that moment, history held its breath. The masses had chosen Barabbas. The man of peace was condemned. Faith, politics, and power collided with irreversible force, setting in motion the events that would echo through centuries. The verdict was not merely a human judgment, it was the prelude to a confrontation that transcended time and empire. The road to Golgotha, the streets of Jerusalem were alive with tension and whispers of disbelief. Jesus, condemned by the crowd and delivered into Roman custody, began the grueling journey toward Golgotha, the place of execution. The city, already brimming with pilgrims for Passover, bore witness to a spectacle that blurred the lines between politics, fear, and faith. Every step was watched, every movement scrutinized by both the empire and the religious elite. The Roman soldiers, trained for efficiency and obedience, forced Jesus to carry the heavy crossbeam, a symbol of humiliation and authority. Their presence was stark and unyielding, a reminder that empire ruled with iron and fear. Yet, even amidst suffering, Jesus moved with a quiet dignity, a moral authority that contrasted sharply with the coercion surrounding him. Crowds lined the streets, some in silent grief, some cheering, others simply witnessing history unfold. Simon of Cyrene was pressed into service, compelled to assist with the cross. The act highlighted the inescapable grip of Rome on every life in Judea. Obedience was mandatory, and the machinery of the empire required compliance, whether willing or forced. For the disciples and followers, the journey was heartbreakingly instructive, a vivid demonstration of the collision between divine purpose and human authority. The religious leaders, stationed at key points along the route, watched with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Their scheming had succeeded in condemning Jesus, but the unpredictability of the people's loyalty and emotion remained a concern. Rome's public execution would be the final statement, a warning to anyone who might challenge authority, both sacred and secular. As Jesus approached Golgotha, the air grew heavier with anticipation. The tension was not just physical, but symbolic. Here, power, faith, politics, and morality converged. The cross was not merely a method of execution, it was the ultimate collision of empire and spiritual authority. The soldiers represented Roman control. The priests represented manipulated religious power, and Jesus represented a higher law, one that transcended fear, coercion, and human judgment. By the time the hill came into view, the city seemed to hold its collective breath. The stage was set for the crucifixion, a convergence of human ambition, political calculation, and divine purpose. Every observer, every participant became part of a story that would echo far beyond the narrow streets of Jerusalem, reshaping the understanding of power, authority, and faith for all time. The cross and the clash of powers. Golgotha loomed ahead, stark against the midday sky. The hill was more than a site of execution, it was a stage where empire, religious authority, and divine purpose converged. Jesus, bearing the weight of the cross and the weight of destiny, ascended the slope with a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. Roman soldiers flanked him, their discipline unyielding, yet powerless against the moral authority he radiated. The crowd at Golgotha was a mix of curiosity, fear, grief, and manipulated anger. The Jewish leaders watched with a mix of satisfaction and unease. Their long-sought plan had reached its apex, yet even in their triumph, uncertainty lingered. Rome's machinery was ready to enforce order, to demonstrate power through pain and death. Yet the people who had followed Jesus, inspired by his teachings and miracles, could not be fully controlled. The crucifixion was as much political theater as it was execution. To the Romans, it was a warning, defiance of authority, whether through rebellion or influence, would be met with ultimate force. To the religious elite, it was a temporary silencing of a moral threat, a demonstration that earthly power could suppress spiritual influence at least, in the short term. And to the disciples and followers, it was the darkest of nights, a moment that would challenge their understanding of justice, authority, and faith. Jesus was nailed to the cross, yet his resolve did not waver. Every act of cruelty inflicted by Rome, every hammer, every lash, every taunt was met with calm, even compassion. His suffering transcended the political calculations of men, demonstrating that true authority did not reside in coercion, intimidation, or manipulation, but in moral courage, spiritual conviction, and love that defied violence. The sky darkened as he hung on the cross, a stark reminder of the tension between human ambition and divine purpose. Soldiers cast lots for his garments. Priests watched the outcome with apprehension, and the people witnessed the ultimate collision of authority and faith. What Rome intended as a demonstration of power became, in its spiritual magnitude, a lesson on the fragility of empire and the enduring force of truth. The crucifixion of Jesus was more than an execution. It was the apex of a confrontation between politics, power, and faith. Every participant, from governor to guard, priest to disciple, became part of an unfolding history that would echo across centuries, challenging humanity to reconsider what true authority and justice. Darkness at the summit. The sky over Golgotha darkened, as if the heavens themselves mourned the events unfolding below. Jesus hung on the cross, each breath a testament to endurance, each word a message that transcended the pain of the moment. Around him, Rome's soldiers maintained their grim ritual. The temple elite watched with guarded satisfaction, and the crowd wavered between awe, sorrow, and indifference. The political and religious stakes had collided into a single, unavoidable moment. Rome displayed power through suffering and death, making an example of a man accused of challenging authority. The Jewish leaders sought to protect their control, seeing the execution as a solution to a problem that had grown to large for their comfort. Yet, in the midst of this orchestrated spectacle, a higher authority quietly unfolded, moral, spiritual, and enduring. Jesus spoke to those around him, even in agony, offering words of forgiveness and comfort. To the soldiers and the onlookers, his authority was visible not in rebellion or force, but in restraint, courage, and truth. The very act of hanging on the cross, passive yet resolute, unsettled the assumptions of power and control. The empire could impose suffering. The priests could manipulate law, but they could not extinguish the truth that radiated from him. The crowd reacted in varied ways. Some mocked, parroting the temple elite's narrative of blasphemy and threat. Others wept quietly, hearts breaking at the injustice they witnessed. Pilate, observing from a distance, recognized the irony. The empire's might could not control the intangible forces at work, the devotion, the moral conviction, the spiritual authority that now stood, unbowed, even in death. As the hours passed, the final moments drew near. Darkness enveloped the city, an unnatural shadow that seemed to mark the gravity of the moment. The air was thick with tension, a mix of fear, reverence, and confusion. Here, politics, power, and faith collided in a way that transcended time. What Rome intended as demonstration of control became a revelation of the fragility of human authority when confronted with purpose, truth, and divine will. The crucifixion was not merely an execution. It was a lesson, a confrontation, and a turning point. Empires, religious hierarchies, and human ambition had met a force that could not be measured by armies or decrees. Darkness at the summit marked both an ending and a beginning, a moment where history, politics, and faith intertwined forever. Triumph beyond the cross. The tomb was sealed, the stone rolled, and the city of Jerusalem returned to its uneasy rhythm. Rome had exercised its authority. The temple elite believed their power secure, and the crowd had dispersed, unaware of the forces at play beyond the grave. Yet the story was far from over. What had seemed like a defeat, an end orchestrated by politics and fear, was about to reveal a reality that transcended both human power and temporal authority. In the stillness of dawn, the stone was found moved. The tomb, once a symbol of finality, became a beacon of hope. Jesus had risen, fulfilling the prophecy and demonstrating a power that no empire, law, or human scheme could suppress. The resurrection was more than a miraculous event. It was the ultimate confrontation between faith and worldly authority. Rome had ruled through force, the temple leaders through manipulation. Yet life, truth, and divine purpose had emerged triumphant. The disciples, who had fled in fear, now became witnesses to a reality that redefined their understanding of power and loyalty. Their teacher, who had walked the road of suffering without resistance, now stood alive, validating every teaching, every miracle, and every moment of moral authority. The chains of fear that had bound them were broken, replaced with courage, conviction, and an unwavering commitment to a mission greater than themselves. Across Judea, word of the resurrection spread, shaking the foundations of both empire and religious hierarchy. People began to question what they had accepted as power, control, and authority. The lessons of Golgotha echoed through the streets. Force may punish, Schemes may deceive, but the influence of truth, compassion, and moral courage endures far beyond human constraints. Pilate, the soldiers, and the religious leaders had acted according to their understanding of power, yet none could contain the transformative force that now moved in the hearts of people. What Rome intended as suppression became a catalyst for faith that would ripple across nations and centuries. The triumph beyond the cross was not merely spiritual, it was historical, political, and revolutionary in its implications. Faith had confronted empire, justice had transcended manipulation, authority, moral and divine, had redefined itself in the midst of human weakness and ambition. In the end, the story of Jesus and the Roman Empire is a testament to the enduring power of truth, courage, and faith. Politics, power, and human schemes collide, but they cannot overcome the force of a purpose rooted in love, justice, and divine destiny. History had witnessed a transformation, and the world would never be the same.